Dr. Jennifer Trenzo, our special speaker today. She is Associate Professor of Anthropology and an expert on the Galt family that lived here at the U.S. Arsenal. So I'm very excited to hear more about that. Thank you so much, Dr. Trenzo.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Okay. It's great to have my mother's voice. I have actually become attached to the Galt family by doing this research over the last 5 years, and it's ironic that so many of my friends live in the Richmond, Virginia area, the Western Virginia area, where this family actually originated. It's all just like serendipitous in a way, and some of the information that I'm missing that I will address today is stuff that I can easily get just by going to visit friends. So it's really kind of cool. One of the other things I want to point out is that this project was not just mine. Maggie Needham was the former curator of the archaeology lab, and she was very much involved with doing the research for the published version of this presentation. So Maggie's not here today, but I feel that it is absolutely necessary to acknowledge the work that she did to make this project possible. Now, for those of you that aren't aware of the Augusta Arsenal, the Somerville campus of Augusta University contains many of the buildings that were part of the Augusta Arsenal, which was a military site that produced arms and armaments and stored arms and armaments, mainly for the U.S. military, with the notable exception of the Civil War period. The arsenal existed on this site from the mid-1820s until the mid-1950s, when the U.S. government closed the arsenal and ceded the property to the Academy of Richmond County. Today, the arsenal and our campus are both part of the Somerville National Historic District. The National Historic Neighborhood. The Galt family. 19th century military sites are not commonly visualized as family spaces. However, the Augusta Arsenal had several commanding officers, several support officers, and often their families present throughout its history. One such officer was John Minson Galt III. Whether he was a major in the U.S. military is debatable. Major was the title that he had when he left the U.S. military and joined the Confederacy. Whether he was a physician is actually a little debatable. In many documents that have been unearthed from later in his life, he is often referred to as Dr. John Galt, but there is no record of him ever having actually attended medical school. There are lots of John Galts in his family, many of whom were actually doctors, however. But John Minson Galt III moved to the Augusta Arsenal to serve as the military storekeeper of ordnance in 1847, and he brought along his wife, Anne White Land Galt, and their children. The Galts originated amongst the 19th century Virginia gentry. John came from a long line of medical professionals, and he was actually related to President Zachary Taylor. Anne was the daughter of Francis Land VI, a prominent plantation owner and land speculator in the Tidewater, Virginia area. As upper-class Southerners, John and Anne fit in seamlessly with Augusta's elites, whose summer homes neighbored the Arsenal here in Somerville, and gradually these summer homes became full-time residences throughout the 1850s. The Galts witnessed the expansion of the Somerville community into a mansion district, and they likely participated in the social scene of the Augusta elite. So today, I'm going to explore the lives of the Galt family at the Augusta Arsenal, with a particular focus on Anne Galt's efforts to raise pious children in the midst of a military setting. One of the other things I'm going to do today is examine the lives of the kids as adults, which has been some really interesting research, much of which has just taken shape over the last week and a half or so. While at the Arsenal, the Galts felt pressured by changes in the antebellum family that were shaped by religious movements such as the Second Great Awakening, the changes in what historians often refer to as the cult of domesticity, which looks largely at women's roles in the home and in child raising, and actually in society at large. They were also impacted by changes in ideas about educating female children, and they were impacted by the rise of conspicuous consumption through marketing campaigns that were targeted at children. So during their occupation at the arsenal, the Galt family left behind a lot of artifacts that will be used to examine how these items reinforced or contradicted the notions of the Southern family. Now, there were some differences between home life for Northern families and Southern families that emerged in the middle of the 19th century. Northern middle and upper class families kind of underwent what has become known as separation of spheres. Men moved their businesses out of their homes, and they moved their businesses to downtown areas or places that were away from the home. Women up north basically became in charge of running the home. So Northern women's authority in the home increased as they took charge of managing household budgets and the servants while they lived in the cities, and that afforded them greater opportunities to participate in social activism and quote-unquote mother society more generally. For both Northern and Southern women, however, the cult of domesticity emphasized the idea of the home as a sanctuary and a shrine to the family. Religious dogmas that arose during the Second Great Awakening that made mothers in both regions responsible for raising pious children, and these children were supposed to have pure souls. Regardless of the region, mothers staked their reputations on raising moral, obedient, and virtuous children who would behave responsibly and respectfully in public, or in the presence of guests and in the context of the home. South, families were more isolated due to the rural character of Southern communities. Men remained closer to home, often conducting business within the home, and this reflects a rigid type of paternalism in Southern families that emerged that allowed men to maintain managerial authority in the home even if their wives were managing the household servants and providing most of the primary care for the children. Southern men also took on a larger role in raising their sons, particularly educating them, disciplining them, and socializing their sons to become gentlemen. Fathers and mothers alike disciplined their sons through sympathy, which means sons were admonished for their transgressions, but there was an underlying understanding that gaming and other forms of rambunctious or questionable behavior were a rehearsal for the experiences the boys might have as young men in college or the military. In other words, boys will be boys, and they got away with more. So during the 19th century, your upper-class boys received much of their early education in academic subjects in the home, being tutored by their fathers, but they often went north as young men to obtain a college education, so they had to be prepared to participate in the drinking and gaming that occurred on college campuses, as well as in those secret societies that would extend their social networks. And yes, those secret societies exist. In short, though college-age Southern men were encouraged to maintain their sense of duty towards family, they were encouraged to nurture their family connections, and they were supposed to adhere to the South's dedication to slavery as an institution. That boys will be boys mentality informed how men were socialized as children in the South, and their boyhood transgressions were viewed as part of their preparation for adulthood. To the north, notions of Southern womanhood prized domesticity and essentially sanctified motherhood in ways that made mothers solely responsible for the spiritual well-being of their children, and even blamed them for coveting a child too much if a child was miscarried or somehow passed away before they reached adulthood. Effectively, evangelical definitions of Southern womanhood made mothers responsible for instilling God-fearing piety, virtue, frugality, moderation, and respect for both earthly and godly authority in their children. Southern evangelicalism portrayed childhood as a formative stage that defined one's character and carried lifelong impacts. To protect their children's souls, Southern women were expected to hold daily Bible study at home and make sure their children attended organized church services regularly. Mothers read stories to their children to reinforce the piety, self-control, and age-related levels of responsibility that were demanded of Southern children. Mothers encouraged their children to pray to the Lord for strength and forgiveness for even the smallest transgressions. Successful nurturing of a child's soul was reinforced by the child's religious conversion and resulted in a pious reputation that would culminate in good marriages, guarantee their salvation. And girls were actually expected to gain full church membership in their middle teens, while boys were allowed to hold out until young adulthood. Also had greater responsibility for raising daughters. Southern women were socializing their daughters to become good mothers and good wives. Those God-fearing values were also part of instilling an almost submissive respect for Southern men, and this Southern girl's reputation often depended on publicly displaying her virtuousness and exhibiting her refinement in society. Early 19th century girls had been homeschooled as thoroughly as their brothers. But by the middle 19th century, there was a shift in ideas about educating girls, and it moved back towards mothers educating their daughters mainly through Bible study and teaching them household management and childcare skills. The shift back to domestic education resulted from a set of social ideals that suggested that over-educating girls caused some young women to experience extended periods of depression in young adulthood, and it often led to them delaying marriage. Yes, there are some faces in the audience amongst my colleagues going, whoa, really? Yes, really. These are the ideals that emerged about educating girls in the middle 19th century. So as a result of the shift in educational philosophy, middle 19th century girls had little schooling in science, math, literature, foreign language, until they reached their middle teens. In the Deep South, between the age of about 14 and 17, upper-class girls often entered finishing schools to study these academic subjects so that they could gain some measure of intellectual appeal that would allow them to find a husband following their social debut, which occurred sometime between the age of 17 and 19, usually. Additionally, Southern women's virtue was a measure of her marriageability. Upper-class Southern girls and young women were not allowed to be in the presence of a young man without a chaperone, and they were forbidden from engaging in open flirtation or courting before they were officially engaged. To establish their piety in the community, girls were expected to become public members of their church earlier than boys. They were expected to serve in church-based women's volunteer societies and aid in teaching Sunday school for young children or enslaved peoples. Young women needed to be virtuous, pious, and educated, quote-unquote, enough to avoid spinsterhood or settling for marriage partners that were considered somehow below their station. For Southern mothers, their mothering skills carried high stakes. Regardless of biological sex, if their children grew up to be morally decrepit drunkards, vagabonds, vandals, gamblers, blasphemers, thieves, or sex fiends, or if they simply showed a penchant for materialism, a lack of self-control, a lack of ambition, a lack of charity, a lack of humility, and a lack of selflessness, the Southern cult of domesticity considered women failed or neglectful mothers. Those are some high standards. Because let's face it, we all make mistakes when we're growing up, right? Household. John and Ann Galt came of age during the Second Great Awakening in Virginia high society, and they were firmly influenced by those evangelical ideals that I have just outlined. Ann Galt would have been no stranger to the expectations of the evangelical version of the cult of domesticity. And she would have been no stranger to the roles that each parent was supposed to play in raising proper and pious children. But the arsenal environment presented challenges to instilling piety, moderation, discipline, and virtue. The arsenal was a dangerous space where metal casting, blacksmithing, weapons testing, weapons storage, and training drills were common. All of those things could put children's safety at risk. But there were also these cavorting young soldiers who used foul language and engaged in gambling and drinking. And the Galt boys would have been exposed to these bad behaviors, while the Galt girls may have been exposed to catcalls and tempted to return flirtations. Despite Anne Galt's best efforts, there are artifacts her family left behind at the arsenal that reflects that the Galt children were not always little angels. Guess what? They were kids. Okay? For example, the presence of marbles suggests that the Galt boys may have engaged in what the 19th century parenting advice literature referred to as games of chance. One version of marbles was known as for keepsies, and it effectively meant that any marbles that were won during the game were kept by the winner. That advice literature suggested that allowing boys to play marbles could lead to moral destruction because for keepsies was essentially a form of gambling. But again, because Southern boys were given more leeway in their behavior, any consequences for the Galt boys might have been negligible at best. In fact, being socialized in a military atmosphere may have benefited John Galt's sons, Francis, John IV, and Herbert, because all of them went into the military. Likely played with toy tea sets and dolls that would have socialized them towards filling the role of little mother, and instilled the social graces and mothering skills that were desirable amongst mid-19th century Southern belles, quote unquote. As the oldest daughter, Mary would have been the most indoctrinated into the role of little mother. Together, both Mary and Anne would have attempted to teach pious motherhood to the younger adult girls as well. Fragments from a miniature tea set, along with leg and torso pieces from miniature dolls, suggest that the Galt girls were socialized into motherhood and raised with Southern social graces. These dolls, that were played with perhaps in a dollhouse, through these things, the Galt girls could emulate the role of mother. And they could also emulate the social graces that they were supposed to learn to be part of Southern high society. So playtime became an exercise to reinforce appropriate virtuous behavior at home and at social gatherings. And these social gatherings were hosted sometimes by the arsenal's various commanders or by the arsenal's socially important neighbors. John Galt was an intermittent ranking officer at the arsenal. He was never actually commander of the arsenal, and it's doubtful whether anybody who was ever stationed at the arsenal actually held the title of commander, or commandant, as the case may be. There was always a ranking officer, however. Many times when officers who ranked higher than John were absent because maybe they went to Florida to engage in some of the Indian wars, or they went to Texas to engage in some of the wars with Mexico, John would become the ranking officer at the arsenal. And this meant that John and Anne and their children would have hosted social events, and they would have needed to attend gatherings held by their elite neighbors. So this means that the playtime that the Galt girls had with these tea sets and these dolls allowed them to practice internalizing the behaviors and mannerisms that embodied Southern womanhood. These ideas of piety, purity, moderation, submissiveness, and domesticity. The infamous window that many of you have gone to see today. There are many different ways to interpret this window. The version that is in the publication is really just one. A different way to interpret this window occurred to me today, because one of the things that I noticed for the first time today, despite having seen this window dozens of times, is that Lucy's name appears most often on this window. Emily's name is really only visible once on one of the window panes. And it actually suggests to me that maybe Emily was not actually etching the window, maybe it was Lucy. And the one signature that has a date after it is actually Lucy's. Emily's is not there. But the older Galt girls, Mary, Emily, Louisa, and Lucy, were respectively about 12, 10, 8, and 6 years old when they first moved to the arsenal. It's quite possible that Mary was supposed to keep track of her younger sisters, especially when her mother was recovering from birthing the 4 youngest Galts who were born at the arsenal between 1847 and 1855. However, at some point, at the very least Lucy, and possibly Lucy and Emily, were left unsupervised long enough to attempt to etch their names in this window. Now, one of the possible interpretations is that some of these etchings occurred earlier in childhood, and while it doesn't really show up well on this screen, the area that is circled in red has some really big, lightly inscribed L's in it, where Lucy was trying very hard to inscribe the window. That would suggest that maybe she didn't have the upper body strength to do it. Maybe she didn't realize that pressing in a smaller area harder would actually allow her to inscribe the window. But she practiced before she was actually able to get the names in the window. Lucy was about 10 when the family moved into Bellevue Hall. Emily would have been about 14. The early attempts might have actually been Lucy's handiwork alone. All of the attempts might have been Lucy's handiwork alone. But then there's the fact that Lucy has this signature that is followed by 1861. And when you look at the left window pane, the one that is actually cut out in the highlight, no, that's the right window pane. But on the left window pane where it is actually inscribed 1861, it is only Lucy's signature. On the right window pane, which is in the cutout, you can see that the girls were stronger. They might not have had really good control over the object that they were using to inscribe the window, which I will address later. But you can see that they were stronger. They were also better at penmanship because they could inscribe in smaller letters. So that suggests that those smaller signatures took place later in time. But the question becomes, why would Lucy put her signature on the window with 1861 after it? The Galts left the arsenal in 1861, shortly after it was handed over to the Confederacy. John Galt Sr., John III, did become a Confederate officer, but he didn't remain in Augusta. He took his family back to Virginia, and he became a post commissary at an outpost in Lynchburg, Virginia. So in 1861, as the Galt family was leaving, Lucy, possibly Emily, may have etched this window to immortalize themselves in a house they felt was built for them, because the Galts were the first family to occupy Bellevue Hall. They arrived here in 1857. A former history major and former military person, Bill Wells, did some research on the construction of Bellevue, and his research revealed it was built in 1850. So it was built 3 years, well, it was built over the 3-year period when the Galts first arrived. So regardless of when the etchings were done or why, they do represent a sense of self-importance. And this might contradict the humility, selflessness, and submissiveness that was required of Southern womanhood. This December mug, it represents the rampant materialism that arose in the middle 19th century to challenge Anne Galt's attempts to instill frugality and moderation in her children. In the middle 19th century, Christmas had not yet begun to emphasize celebrating the birth of Christ. Instead, Christmas was still caught up in the older traditions about celebrating the holiday, where Christmas was largely a hedonistic pursuit of drunken excess, and In the late 19th century, it was slowly transforming into a celebration of materialism that was accelerated through advertising campaigns that targeted kids. This cheap Staffordshire children's toy mug commemorates the month of December. And you can see that it has a verse on it that talks about pleasures and treasures. And you can see that it has an image on it of a child pulling a wagon full of toys. These mugs were very popular by the 1840s. It's actually possible that the Galt children had an entire set because the mugs were cheap. They were only about a penny each. It's also possible that it was gifted to the Galts at some point because they had 2 children that were born in December. But having a nearly complete mug is actually archaeologically pretty important because it suggests that it might have been purposely thrown away, and it might have been purposely thrown away whole, so that as more things got piled on top of it in the trash pit that it was disposed of in, it broke. And this might actually suggest that someone purposely got rid of it. Now, who that person might be could have been Anne Galt herself, Mama Anne, because she does have a daughter named Anne as well. And the daughter named Anne grew up to become an Episcopal nun. And this suggests that perhaps as the most devout of the Galts, Anne may have been the one who rejected the idea and threw it away. Now, Anne provides a jumping off point into talking about what happened to the Galt kids as adults. She did become an Episcopal nun in the Sisterhood of St. Mary's Episcopal Church in Sewanee, Tennessee. At some point in her tenure there, she became mistress of novices. In a convent, novices are the new recruits. So she was the one that was responsible for looking after them, making sure they obeyed the rules, etc. The St. Mary's Episcopal Church in Sewanee, Tennessee was really a mission. And Sewanee is a small town that is actually between Nashville and Chattanooga. And the goal of the church was to provide educational opportunities for people that lived in the mountains so that they could better their lives. Anne's name in the church was Sister Herberta. She took a name that commemorated her brother Herbert, and I will explain why she did that later on. A short obituary for Anne appeared in a DC newspaper, and you can see it on the screen here. She passed away on July 14th, 1925, and this obituary suggests she had become Mother Superior of the convent in 1909. She's buried in Sewanee, Tennessee, in her church's cemetery, and she was 77 years old. What happened to the rest of the Galts? It has been so much fun tracking down what happened to the rest of the Galts. And there have been moments when I was just like, no way, I can't believe one of you did this. And it's not just for the child who became a little infamous either. And it's not just for Emily, who is the subject of our campus ghost story, which I'm saving Emily for last. But what happens to the Galt family is that they move to Lynchburg for the most part. John Galt Sr., Dr. John Galt III, he passes away in 1868. His wife passes away in 1884. They're both buried in Lot 12 of the Presbyterian Cemetery in Lynchburg, Virginia, with 2 of their children. It's been so easy to follow up on the Galt kids and know for sure that I have found the right Galts. And that's no small feat in Virginia. There are Galts that are centered in the Williamsburg area, and there are multiple John Galts in every generation. There are multiple Lucy Galts in every generation. There are multiple Emily Galts in every generation. And even more frustratingly, a lot of them seem to be born around the same time. But one of the ways that I could actually link them to one another is that there are some Galts that have fairly unique names in their families. And one of the ways I could actually link them together is through census data. when they were still living in the same houses with their parents. Um, so the Galt kids, like Anne, ended up in a religious organization, but one of her sisters becomes a government employee, a federal government employee at that. 3 of her brothers go into military service, and most of the sisters, other than Emily, Anne, and Fanny, simply got married and had families. But I'm going to give you some details about each of them. The only one I've been able to find a photo of so far is Francis Land Galt. And that's because Francis was pretty famous in his day. He was the eldest of the Galt children, and before the Civil War, he was a surgeon in the U.S. Army. When the Civil War began, he left the Union Army and became a surgeon in the Confederate Navy. He sailed on the CSS Sumter and the CSS Alabama with famous Confederate naval commander Raphael Semmes. Semmes was famous because the Sumter and the Alabama cruised the Atlantic between the coast of the U.S. and the coast of France. They cruised down in the Caribbean, and they cruised the east coast of South America as well. These 2 ships under the command of Semmes took the most prizes of any Confederate captain, basically. And prizes meant they seized the most enemy ships. They seized 65 ships that were either U.S. merchant ships or commissioned U.S. naval vessels by the end of the Civil War. Now, the Alabama was taken by the U.S. Navy at the Battle of Cherbourg in 1864 in France. And Francis somehow made it to shore, and then he made it back to the U.S., where he served on a naval vessel in Virginia. And somehow, even though he was in the Navy, he was among those who surrendered at Appomattox. Now, for those of you that don't know where Appomattox, Virginia is, it is inland south central Virginia. About the only major bodies of water in Appomattox are some big creeks. So what a naval man would be doing there for the surrender, I have no idea, but that could actually be part of his legend. Okay? Now, in 1871, Francis hooked up with an old naval buddy and went to South America. And in South America, they cruised the northern reaches of the Amazon River, and they mapped the northern reaches of the Amazon River. Francis returns to Virginia in 1875. In 1880, he marries Lucy Harrison Randolph, and he settles into the life of a medical doctor in a small town in western Virginia that is known as Upperville, Virginia. They had 2 children. Francis died November 18th, 1915, and he's buried next to his wife in Ivy Hill Cemetery in Upperville. Now, Francis kept a diary when he was on his Amazonian trip. And that diary was sold by a relative to the Bureau of American Ethnology for $200 in 1938. That diary is currently on file at the Smithsonian Institution in the National Anthropological Archives, and it is still considered to this day one of the earliest credible ethnographic treatments of the indigenous peoples of Peru. I want to go read it. I really do. Now, John IV and his brother Herbert are on the same slide for a reason. There's not much out there about John IV, and quite honestly, I only figured out exactly what happened to him last night, because yet another website came up that dealt with the Confederate Army 2nd Cavalry that provided the troop lists and actually summarized what happened to each member. So John Galt IV was a Confederate soldier. Several of those, the published family genealogies suggest that he died on June 4th in 1863 or 1864. They differ on the actual year. But this new website I found said he was a private in the Confederate Army in the 2nd Cavalry. He worked as a clerk for his father, who was the post commissary at Lynchburg. And in June 1863, John IV died of diphtheria in Rappahannock County, Virginia. Rappahannock County is nowhere near Lynchburg. It is over near Fairfax, Virginia, south of D.C. by about 20 miles. This is the area in Virginia where Mosby's Rangers actually conducted guerrilla warfare against the Union troops behind Union lines. And this is important because Herbert Galt seems to join Mosby's Rangers in April of 1863, when he is about 17 years old. Herbert serves in Company D of Colonel John Singleton Mosby's 43rd Cavalry Battalion, which was known as Mosby's Rangers. And as I said, they ran behind the lines, enemy lines in the Shenandoah Valley, conducting guerrilla warfare, sneak attacks on Sheridan's troops. Herbert was taken prisoner of war by the Union in Farquhar County, Virginia on May 19, 1864. And he was transferred to Fort Delaware, a Union POW camp in northern Delaware on June 6, 1864. Conditions at Fort Delaware were trying, though it was not one of the worst Union POW camps until late in the war. And summer of 1864 is late in the war. When Herbert was at Fort Delaware held 33,000 POWs. Food rations for the POWs were cut, and this just makes me cry, during 1864 to retaliate on Confederate soldiers for the treatment of Union soldiers in the Confederate POW camps in the South. First of all, Fort Delaware held lotteries to determine who might be executed by the Union Army in retaliation for executions of Union troops in Confederate POW camps. Herbert's post-war activities have been untraceable. However, he died young at the age of 30 on October 7, 1877. He's buried in a plot at the Presbyterian Cemetery in Lynchburg with his father, his mother, and his sister Emily. There's every chance that Herbert succumbed to the effects of post-traumatic stress disorder due to the time he spent in that POW camp. Herbert's the heartbreaker. So was Arthur in his own way. Okay? Arthur was so hard to track down, and I basically had to resort to newspaper research. I could not find him in any census data. I thought that maybe he had died in childhood. But when I was doing some newspaper research on the rest of his siblings, I just said, on a lark, I'm going to look for Arthur. So, several newspaper stories come up from May to mid-June 1875. And they report that young Arthur Galt from Lynchburg robbed $10,000 from the bank where he worked in May 1875. A portion of the money was eventually recovered from a New York bank. Virginia authorities chased Arthur to Montreal, Canada, where he had presented himself to hotel workers as a Southern man who had just inherited a lot of money and was on vacation before his wedding in North Carolina. The hotel employees said this young man was behaving dubiously, what we would consider squirrely, I guess, and he left the hotel without paying his bill or taking any of his things. The authorities went through his things and they found like some furs that he had purchased in Canada and some clothing he had left behind, but they didn't find the rest of the money. In 1875, Arthur Emerson Galt would have been 20 years old and most likely in Lynchburg, where his mother still lived. Arthur does not appear in the 1870 census for any of the locations where his siblings or parents might have resided. So I'm going to say that further research is necessary, but there's a good chance that Arthur became a robber and a con man and disappeared. About the girls. Mary, Louisa, and Lucy married and settled into traditional roles as wives and mothers, but their lives might have differed from one another because of the professions and means of their husbands. Emily, Fanny, and Anne appear to have never married. As noted previously, Anne became a nun. Fanny worked for the federal government in Washington, D.C. for over 40 years, and Emily's story is a little bit different from those of her sisters. But the Galt girls, Mary, she wedded Samuel Boyce of Newberry, South Carolina in November 1854 at St. Paul's Episcopal Church here in Augusta, Georgia. Boyce was the son of a businessman in Charleston. Mary and Samuel initially lived in Aiken County, South Carolina, but by 1870 they were residing with 3 children and Mary's sister Emily in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Boyce's father had given him a piece of land in what is now East Chattanooga, and there is still a section of that city that is referred to as Boyce. They later relocated to Norfolk, Virginia, which is near where Mary's mother was born. Mary passed away in the Ballantine Home for the Aged near Norfolk on April 13, 1913, at age 77. Mary is buried in Elmwood Cemetery in Norfolk, Virginia. At age 22, Louisa married U.S. Army Colonel Thomas General Baylor in 1859, also at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Augusta, Georgia. Thomas was a Yankee, and he stayed in the Union Army when the war started. So Louisa moved north with him, and he commanded an arsenal in Pennsylvania until his death in 1889. They had 2 children. Louisa died on October 21, 1906, at the age of 67, and she is buried with her husband in Arlington National Cemetery. Now, Lucy married in 1869 when she was 28, and she married the former engineer for the Lynchburg outpost that her father once commanded. So her husband, Maurice Hamner Garland, was a Confederate officer. He was an engineer, and after the Civil War, he became a, what did he do? Oh, he became a surveyor for the city of Lynchburg. The Garlands were actually very, very socially connected in Lynchburg, and there is a district in Lynchburg that is known as the Garland Hill Historic District, where pretty much the Garland family all owned houses. Now, Maurice was the son of an academic who was famous in his own right. Maurice's father was president of Randolph-Mason University in Ashland, Virginia, the second president of the University of Alabama, and the first chancellor of Vanderbilt University. With Maurice, Lucy had 4 children, and according to a personal letter written by Maurice in 1900, Lucy and Maurice resided at the house you see in this picture, 303 Madison Street in Lynchburg, Virginia. Lucy died April 15, 1890. Maurice died in 1909, and they are buried in Lot H of the Presbyterian Cemetery in Lynchburg, Virginia. The first third of her life. There's nothing really published about her in census records or anything until she's in her late 30s. But in her late 30s, she apparently moved to D.C. So at the age of 37 in 1889, she was living in Portsmouth when she signed the death certificate for her sister Mary. But sometime between about 1889 and 1890, she moved to Washington, D.C. Records from 1908 and 1944 show that Fanny lived in an upscale area of Washington, D.C. in very posh surroundings in a suite at the hotel that is on the screen. This is the Franklin Square Hotel. It was built in the 1890s, and it was a premier example of Gilded Age architecture. It was decked out in marble, wrought iron, and the wood in the place was often gold-plated around the edges. It served as D.C.'s premier hotel after it opened in the 1890s. An obituary for Fanny from 1944 shows that she worked for the U.S. Treasury Department for 40 years. Then she spent over 20 more years working as a clerical assistant for the U.S. House of Representatives. Fanny got national coverage in the newspapers in 1908 because a clipping from the El Paso Herald in Texas reported that she took a photo of her brother Francis to the White House to present to President William Howard Taft. And this picture showed Francis and Taft's uncle together on one of Francis's many adventures earlier in life. That newspaper article placed her living in the Franklin Square Hotel. Census records from 1940, Fanny was 89 years old. She was living in a retirement home at 1332 I Street in Washington, D.C. In May 1944, she passed away at the age of 93 and was buried in Fort Lincoln Cemetery. So now we get to Emily. The well-known story in local Augusta lore and in the lore of our university is that Emily ended her own life while at the Augusta Arsenal when she found out that her fiancé had died near the start of the Civil War. The lore suggests that her ghost haunts what's now Bellevue Hall. The story just isn't true. It's unlikely that Emily's diamond engagement ring was used to etch Lucy and Emily's names in that window that's on display in Bellevue right now as well, because even amongst the upper classes in both Europe and the US, pearls were still the most common stone placed in engagement rings in the 1860s. Diamond engagement rings were only common amongst European royalty in the mid-19th century because the price of diamonds was astronomical. The price of diamonds did not decrease enough to infiltrate the American market in any quantity until the De Beers diamond mines were discovered in South Africa in the 1880s. So diamonds did not become the standard for engagement rings in the US until the 1950s. So it's probably not her ring that etched that window. It's possible to etch windows with iron. It's possible to cut windows with iron. So there's any number of things that could have been used to etch that window. That engagement ring is probably part of that story. Documents show that Emily died on March 27, 1914, at the age of 74 in the Eastern State Hospital, which was a mental hospital in Williamsburg, Virginia. The Eastern State Hospital had been run by a long line of her Galt cousins going all the way back to the 1770s. Her cause of death, and this is on the death certificate that is on the screen, is listed as a cerebral hemorrhage with insanity as a contributing factor. This is indeed our Emily Galt because her grave marker is inscribed with the date of March 27, 1914, and she's buried in the Presbyterian Cemetery in Lynchburg, Virginia, with her parents and her brother. Now, how Emily ended up in the asylum, why she ended up in the asylum, I don't really know, and it's going to require some follow-up research. But there is a pattern with Emily. When the family leaves the arsenal, she lives with Mary in Chattanooga for a while. When she was committed to the institution, she was living in Lynchburg, possibly with Lucy's family, because Lucy had passed away in 1890. Emily was committed in January of 1896. This basically means that Emily may never have actually lived on her own. And it raises questions about why that might be. It's entirely possible that she had a fiancé who died in the Civil War, and she entered a state of depression to the point where she never recovered. It's entirely possible. It's also entirely possible that Emily was special needs. One of the things that I have been able to track down are the admissions and patient files for the patients, and I'm not going to use the word they used in the 19th century because it's just not a good word. So the patients at the Eastern State Hospital, they're housed at the Library of Virginia in Richmond, Virginia. And because they are over 100 years old at this point, they are public domain and can be used for research purposes. So at some point this summer, when I go up to Virginia to visit friends, one of whom happens to live in Richmond, the two of us are going to go to the Library of Richmond for a day and see what we can find. But in a nutshell, that's the story of the Galts. There's more research to be done into the lives of some of the Galt children after they left the arsenal. I would really like to be able to track down where Arthur went. There are some Arthur Galts in California in 1880, but many of them seem to have been born out there in about 1860. So that's probably not our Arthur. But Arthur may be impossible to track down because he may have just changed his name. and disappeared. But you can see that regardless of how they behaved as children, most of the Galt kids grew up to be pretty formidable adults with pretty big responsibilities. You can see that the legend of Emily Galt is a cool ghost story, but it's just a story. You can see that being mischievous children didn't corrupt the spirits of most of the Galt children, but then there is Arthur. And I do actually admit, and I'm going to end this on a humorous note, I was sitting on my couch with my laptop in my lap when I was doing the newspaper research on the Library of Congress's historical newspapers database. And when I got some hits on Arthur, I got really excited. And then I blew up the page so that I could actually read it. And the opening line was about him robbing a bank. And I literally threw my hands up and went, "Oh, Arthur, no!" Broke your mother's heart. It's like, so yes, Arthur, the most infamous of the Galt children. So questions, comments? Yes. That, but I mean, his father dying in 1868, he was probably only about 10 years old. He would have been raised largely by his mother, maybe with the influence of Lucy's husband. He might have had Herbert living in the house with him, who may not have been stable. You know, so Arthur may not have had the best childhood, shall we say. It shocks me that he would have robbed a bank because the Galts were moneyed. The Galts had money, going all the way back to the 1700s when they first arrived in the Virginia area. Every single branch of that family had money. It's almost like he wanted to be independent and away from that family, so he wanted to find a way where he didn't have to rely on a inheritance or something to do it. The odd thing is he didn't end up with any of the money that he stole, except maybe about 1,600 of it that he used to flee to wherever he went. Now keep in mind, $1,600 back then was a lot of money, don't get me wrong, but you know, it's still only $1,600 when he stole 10 grand. So, other questions? Yes? No, I have not found anything about that. Yeah, it's a mystery. One of the things that is a big mystery about this family is Emily. You know, we know where she was, we know where she died. We don't really know what happened to her. I did find from the 1880s newspapers and the 1880 census a reference to an E. Galt that was working as a teacher in an orphanage in Washington, D.C. She might have been with Fanny for a little while, but at the same time, there's no other real mention of her. And there's also so many cousins named Emily that easily could have been a cousin E. Galt, not our Emily. So it's kind of, it's a mystery. And I'm hoping that some of the mystery will be solved by looking at those hospital records. Any other questions? Yeah, I actually find historical research relaxing. It is such a distraction from everything else that I need to do that I can go down a rabbit hole and 14 hours later I'm just like, oh, how did this happen? You know? I started out as a historian and became a historical archaeologist, and there are times when I'm just like, maybe I should just go back to being a historian. It's more fun. So, but yeah, I've become attached to this family. And Herbert's story really chokes me up because, yeah, I can't imagine being in a place like Fort Delaware. Yes? They went to church at St. Paul's. When they moved down here, the Presbyterian Church was undergoing some sort of schism, and they were possibly a little more liberal than the more conservative aspects of the Presbyterian Church. So they went Episcopal because the Episcopals were a little more liberal than Augusta. So yeah.
And it's interesting that she became a nun because
Right.
of the Episcopal Church, which is.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions? If you have questions, feel free to email me. Track me down if you see me on campus. And I really want to thank, once again, Maggie for helping out with this. And I also want to thank Leanne, because Leanne has been very supportive of my research into the Augusta Arsenal over the years. And she's actually helped me understand some things about the Arsenal that I didn't quite understand at times. So thank you, Leanne. So.
Thank you so much, Dr. Trenzo. Thanks to Pamplin College and for the Pamplin College Guardhouse Museum Committee for making our pop-up exhibit and talk possible today. If you want to see some of the artifacts, like the December mug, it's on display at our Guardhouse Museum in the corner of campus. It's open Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. Thank you, guys.